The old armchair smells faintly of lavender and dust. It's the same armchair I sank into 25 years ago, weeping into its worn velvet after discovering the lie that crumbled my first life. It's still here, in this small apartment that feels more like a harbor than a home, nestled on the 7th floor of a building that has witnessed more of my quiet triumphs and private despairs than any person could ever guess. My son-in-law, Thomas, calls it cramped. He says it's cozy in that way people do when they mean inadequate. He says, usually with a chuckle directed at my daughter Sarah, who offers only a weak, conciliatory smile, that it's barely big enough to swing a cat. His eyes, cool and assessing, sweep over the faded Persian rug, the stacks of books threatening to avalanche from their shelves, the small kitchenette where I make do with 3 pots and a single frying pan. He sees scarcity. He sees a woman who stopped striving years ago, content to shrink into a life of modest means and smaller expectations. What he doesn't see, what none of them see, is the deliberate intention behind the perceived limitations. This apartment isn't a cage, it's a veil, a quiet corner of the world where I can breathe, think and observe. The world outside my windows, the one he thinks I merely exist within, is the world I built, piece by painstaking piece. Each brick, each pane of glass, each tenant humming in their own tiny corner of this vast structure below me, represents a choice, a sacrifice, a victory they could never comprehend. When he sits on my thrift store sofa, balancing his expensive coffee cup precariously on a coaster Sarah probably bought him from a boutique he frequents, he radiates an air of someone who has achieved success effortlessly, born into a world where comfort is a birthright, not a hard-won battleground. He talks about his latest acquisition, a luxury car, a piece of art, a new wing on their sprawling house, with a casual arrogance that grates on my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. Sarah listens, her face alight with wifely admiration, or perhaps just practiced agreement. I watch them, my hands folded calmly in my lap, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. They discuss their future plans, plans that invariably involve large sums of money, plans that often circle back, indirectly at first, to the idea of my situation. My lack of financial burdens, they call it. The freedom of not having assets to manage. They speak of simplifying my life further, perhaps moving me somewhere smaller still, somewhere easier for them to manage. Manage. The word hangs in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Manage me. Manage what little they think I possess. They see me as a problem to be solved, a relic to be tidied away, a potential drain on the vibrant upward trajectory of their lives. The irony is a bitter, sharp taste on my tongue. They talk about investments they're making, opportunities they're pursuing, always just out of reach of the truly big leagues, the kind of wealth that shifts landscapes, not just portfolios. I could offer them advice, insights born from years of navigating the treacherous waters of real estate and investment, but they wouldn't listen. They see my small apartment, my simple clothes, my quiet life, and assume a corresponding smallness of mind, of ambition, of capability. They mistake humility for inability. They mistake deliberate anonymity for irrelevance. The betrayal wasn't just from Thomas, though his specific brand of condescension is particularly galling. It's in the way Sarah allows it, the way she has absorbed his worldview, seeing me not as the mother who clawed her way through poverty and heartbreak to give her a better life, but as a quaint, slightly inconvenient elderly relative who needs their guidance. It's a different kind of pain than the initial shock of my ex-husband's deceit, but perhaps more insidious, a slow erosion of decades of love and sacrifice. I look at Sarah, at the woman she has become, shaped by a world of privilege I fought to give her access to, and a pang of sorrow catches in my chest. Is this what success looks like? A daughter who can't see past the facade, a son-in-law who measures worth in square footage and market value. They underestimate me at their peril, and they have been underestimating me for a very long time. The air in the apartment feels thinner when they leave, cleared of their casual cruelty and suffocating self-importance. I stand by the window, looking down at the bustling street, the taxis honking, the tiny figures hurrying to and fro. I know the rhythm of this city, the pulse of this block, the secrets held within the walls of this building. They think they are the architects of their own destiny, rising effortlessly to the top. They have no idea that the very ground they walk on, the very air they breathe when they visit me, is ground I secured, air I paid for, a structure I built from the foundation up. The little clock on my mantelpiece ticks, a quiet, steady sound in the sudden silence. It's not just a clock, it's a timer. And for Thomas and Sarah, the time is rapidly running out. He came over the following week under the guise of helping me with a small repair. A dripping faucet in the kitchen sink, a minor annoyance, easily fixed, but a perfect opportunity for him to play the competent man of the world, swooping in to rescue the helpless woman from her domestic woes. He arrived in his gleaming SUV, dressed in casual designer clothes that probably cost more than my entire month's expenses. He surveyed the tiny kitchen with a look of polite distaste. "Honestly, Mother," he said, shaking his head slightly, "you should really consider upgrading. This is functional, I suppose, but hardly comfortable. A woman of your age shouldn't have to put up with this." He didn't offer to pay for the upgrade, of course, just stated it as a fact, a judgment on my choices, my perceived lack of ambition or means. I watched him fiddle with the faucet, his large hands looking clumsy with the wrench. He wasn't particularly skilled, but he projected an air of supreme confidence, the kind that comes from never having to truly struggle, never having to learn practical skills out of necessity. "It works," I said simply, leaning against the doorframe. "It's perfectly adequate for one person." "Adequate," he scoffed, not unkindly but dismissively. "That's the word, isn't it? Everything here is just adequate. This building too, a bit dated, wouldn't you say, needs a lot of work, probably doesn't command the highest rents." He glanced out the window, down at the street below, where people were coming and going from the various businesses on the ground floor, the small bakery, the dry cleaner, the local bookstore, businesses I had personally courted, negotiated with, supported over the years. Prime location, of course, he conceded, but wasted on a building like this. Someone with vision could do wonders with it, turn it into luxury condos, maybe, really capitalize on the area. He turned back to me, wiping his hands on a rag he'd brought with him. "Have you ever thought about selling, Mother? Moving somewhere more appropriate, easier? Sarah worries about you being all the way up here, dealing with stairwells if the elevator breaks down." The elevator hadn't broken down in years, not since I'd invested heavily in its modernization 5 years ago, a project he knew nothing about. His concern was a thin veneer over his true interest, liquidating my supposed only asset, this apartment, and perhaps getting his hands on whatever small sum that might fetch, or simply removing me to a place where I'd be less independent, more reliant on them. "It's my home, Thomas," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'm quite happy here." He sighed, a sound of mild exasperation. "But happy isn't the same as comfortable, is it? Or secure. Imagine, Mother, a place with modern amenities, maybe a doorman, better security. You wouldn't have to worry about things like dripping faucets." He finished tightening the faucet, though it still gave a faint intermittent drip. He ignored it. His job was done, the point about my inadequate surroundings made. "You know, I was talking to a colleague the other day," he continued, putting away his tools. "He's in property development. Mentioned he's looking for opportunities in this neighborhood. Said older buildings like this are often undervalued, especially if the owner isn't actively managing it. Said a good offer could be very tempting to the right person." He watched my face, searching for a flicker of interest, a sign of weakness. "Just a thought," he added, shrugging casually. "Something to consider." I met his gaze, my expression unreadable. "I've considered many things over the years, Thomas," I said, "more things than you might imagine." The dripping faucet seemed to punctuate my words. He smiled, a patronizing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Mother, just looking out for you." He left soon after, pleased with himself, no doubt, for planting the seed. He saw my apartment, my life, as a puzzle piece that didn't fit into his neat, prosperous world, a piece he intended to remove. He didn't see the foundation beneath the surface, the intricate network of ownership, management, and planning that extended far beyond the walls of this small space. He saw a woman content with adequate. He had no conception of the sheer, untamed ambition that had simmered beneath the surface of my quiet life for decades, the kind of ambition that built empires from dust and determination. My hands, though they might seem frail to him, were capable of signing checks that could buy and sell companies larger than any he'd ever worked for. My mind, though he saw only domestic simplicity, was accustomed to analyzing market trends, negotiating complex contracts, and foreseeing opportunities years in advance. This apartment was not a sign of my failure or my resignation. It was a strategic position, a place of quiet observation, a front from behind which I could manage my affairs, stay grounded, and yes, perhaps teach a lesson to those who mistook my quietness for weakness. The dripping faucet continued its rhythm after he left, a tiny persistent sound. I walked over and tightened it myself, with a small wrench I kept under the sink. It stopped immediately. Some problems, I thought, just require the right tools, the right knowledge, and the willingness to do it yourself. He had neither, and he had no idea how much he didn't know. My life had been a masterclass in rebuilding. After the initial shock of discovering my ex-husband's double life, the financial ruin he left in his wake, and the sheer soul-deep betrayal, I had two choices: crumble or construct. For Sarah's sake, I chose the latter. We moved into a tiny rented room above a noisy restaurant. I worked 3 jobs: scrubbing floors, waiting tables, sewing clothes late into the night. Every single penny I earned was poured into essentials, and then, eventually, into a small, ugly office space downtown. It was in a dilapidated building, overlooked and undervalued. I saw its potential, its bones, its location. While juggling work and motherhood, I taught myself about property law, zoning regulations, loan applications. I devoured books on investment, devoured market reports. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. My hands were raw from cleaning, my back ached constantly, but my mind was sharp, focused, and fueled by a cold, steady anger. Not the kind of anger that burns bright and fades, but the kind that smolders, providing a constant low heat, driving you forward. Sarah was too young to understand the depth of our poverty, the scale of the betrayal that had necessitated this struggle. She saw only a tired mother who was often absent, whose clothes smelled of grease and detergent. I shielded her from the worst of it, creating a small bubble of normalcy and love within the chaos. I sent her to the best schools I could afford, made sure she had clean clothes and enough food, even if it meant I went without. I wanted her to have the life I couldn't, the life that had been stolen from us. That ugly office space was the first domino. I fixed it up myself, painting walls, repairing floors. I rented it out, using the income to secure a loan for a slightly larger space in the same building. I repeated the process, reinvesting every profit, expanding my foothold in that neglected property. It wasn't glamorous. It was hard, grinding work filled with setbacks, tenants who didn't pay, repairs that cost more than anticipated. But I was relentless. I learned to negotiate hard, to spot a good deal, to manage contractors. I built relationships with local business owners, with the city planning office, with the banks. Slowly, painstakingly, I acquired more and more of the building. When the owner, an absentee landlord tired of the constant problems, finally decided to sell the whole structure, I was the first one he called. I was ready. I secured the financing, not through charm or connections, but through years of meticulous record-keeping, demonstrating a profitability and management skill they couldn't ignore. Despite my humble appearance, buying that first building was a turning point. It wasn't just property, it was vindication. It was the solid, tangible proof of my resilience, my capability. From there, I didn't stop. I used the equity, the income, the knowledge I had gained to invest in other properties, diversifying, expanding, always quietly, always below the radar. I avoided the flashy deals, the public attention. I preferred the anonymity, the ability to move and operate without scrutiny. As my wealth grew, paradoxically, my outward life became simpler. I didn't need the trappings of success. I had the reality of it. When Sarah grew up, went to university, and later met Thomas, I didn't flaunt anything. I presented myself as comfortable, certainly not struggling, but not wealthy either. Just a mother who had worked hard and was now enjoying a quiet retirement. This apartment, the one they see as small and inadequate, was one I specifically chose in this building. Years ago, after I had bought it, it allowed me to be on site, to oversee things directly without raising eyebrows, to maintain a presence without announcing ownership. It was practical, private, and provided a perfect vantage point. I watched Sarah fall for Thomas, a man whose smooth exterior hid, to my eyes, a calculating core. I saw the way his family lived, the expectations they had. I worried, but I couldn't voice my concerns without sounding like a bitter, overly protective mother. So, I waited, I watched, and I prepared. I ensured Sarah had a good education, access to opportunities, a safety net she didn't even know existed. I made sure my own affairs were meticulously in order, legally sound, and structured in a way that protected what I had built. Thomas and Sarah's assumptions about me were a product of their world, a world where wealth was inherited or effortlessly accumulated, not forged in the fires of hardship and betrayal. They saw my quiet life as a sign of limited horizons, not as the carefully constructed fortress it truly was. Their condescension, their pity masked as concern, their casual mockery of my small space, it wasn't just offensive, it was deeply ironic. They were standing on ground I owned, breathing air I controlled, making demands on resources they didn't know I commanded. The years of struggle, the sacrifices, the quiet accumulation of power, it all led to this point, to the moment when their ignorance would collide with my reality. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the collision would be spectacular. Every dismissive glance, every patronizing remark, every assumption they made about my limitations added another layer to the quiet resolve hardening within me. They had underestimated me from the moment they met me, seeing only what they expected to see, and that, I realized, was their greatest mistake. My small apartment was not just a home, it was a stage, and the performance was about to begin. The demands escalated subtly at first, wrapped in layers of concern and familial obligation. Thomas, ever the smooth operator, would bring it up during dinner at their opulent home, a place where every piece of furniture, every fork, seemed to scream of its price tag. Mother, you know, with property values in your area going up, it might be a smart move to leverage your apartment. You could release some capital, enjoy yourself a little, take a trip, maybe leverage my apartment. The words were delivered with a practiced casualness, as if discussing the weather. He spoke of equity lines, of refinancing, of unlocking value. He didn't know I hadn't had a mortgage on that apartment, or the building it was in, for over a decade. It was paid for, freehold, a solid, unencumbered asset generating significant income. And quite comfortable as I am, Thomas, I'd reply, stirring my soup. I don't need to leverage anything. Sarah would chime in, her voice sweet and slightly anxious. Mom, he just means you know it's a good market right now. You could do so much more, so much more. Their vision of so much more invariably involved things they understood, luxury goods, travel, perhaps contributing to their own ventures, easing their financial burdens. They never considered that my so much mores was already happening, just not in a way they could recognize. Then came the not-so-subtle requests. A business opportunity Thomas was pursuing required significant upfront capital. He needed investors. He spoke of impressive returns, guaranteed success, the kind of venture that only came along once in a lifetime. He presented it to me, not as an investment proposal requiring due diligence, but as a chance for me to participate in their success, to contribute to the family's future in a tangible way. The unspoken implication was clear: use the perceived value of my apartment, whatever small savings I might have, to help fund his ambition. He talked about the potential for exponential growth, the sheer scale of the project. It was, he explained, a property development venture. He needed seed money to acquire a key piece of land. He showed me glossy brochures, complex spreadsheets, all designed to impress and overwhelm. He spoke of location, potential yield, market trends. He was confident, almost arrogant in his presentation, assuming my financial illiteracy, my inability to see through the jargon to the underlying risks. "It's a sure thing, Mother," he said, leaning forward, his eyes glinting with enthusiasm. "But time is of the essence. We need to move quickly." I listened patiently, nodding occasionally. I asked a few quiet questions, questions that seemed simple on the surface, but were designed to probe the weaknesses in his plan, questions that showed I wasn't quite as naive as he thought. I asked about zoning, about environmental reports, about community resistance. He brushed them aside, annoyed by the details, eager to get back to the big picture numbers, the impressive projections. "Those are minor issues, Mother, easily handled by our team," he said, dismissively. "The important thing is the potential return. You could double your money, triple it even, in a few years." He spoke as if I had only a small amount of money to double or triple. He had no concept of the actual scale of my assets, the decades of careful strategic investment that had multiplied my initial meager savings into a substantial fortune. I looked at the location he was describing, a promising area on the other side of the city. It was indeed a good location, ripe for development, a location I had considered myself, years ago before focusing my efforts elsewhere. It was ironic, almost comically so, that he was presenting this opportunity to me, asking for my perceived small resources to fund his acquisition of land in an area I had already analyzed, understood, and deliberately chosen not to pursue at that time, for reasons that went far deeper than simple capital. I knew things about that area, about its political landscape, its hidden challenges that weren't in his glossy brochures, things that could derail a project like his entirely. I could have warned him. I could have pointed out the flaws, the hidden pitfalls. But why? He hadn't asked for advice, only for money. He hadn't shown respect for my experience, only condescension for my apparent limitations, and the opportunity to let him stumble, to let his arrogance lead him down a path of potential failure, while he simultaneously mocked my own quiet strength, was becoming increasingly appealing. "I'll think about it, Thomas," I said finally, my voice calm, non-committal. His face fell slightly, disappointed that I hadn't immediately jumped at the chance to participate in his grand scheme. "Well, don't think too long, Mother," he pressed. "Opportunities like this don't wait," Sarah added. "It would really help us out, Mom. It's a big step for Thomas." The pressure was mounting. The expectation was clear. They wanted me to be a part of their narrative of success, but only in the role of the benefactor, the quiet woman contributing her small resources to their grand vision. They saw me as a source of funds, not a source of wisdom or power. They were circling, like sharks, who sensed a bit of chum in the water, completely unaware they were swimming in an ocean I controlled. The audacity of it, the sheer blindness to my true situation, was breathtaking, and it hardened my resolve. They wanted to leverage my apartment. They wanted me to invest in their venture. They wanted to tidy away my life. They would get none of it. Instead, they would get a revelation, a reckoning, and it would begin perhaps with the building he thought was adequate. I needed to consult with Agnes. Agnes wasn't a minor character in my life, though she might appear so to an outsider. She was my lawyer, my confidant, the woman who had helped me navigate the legal minefield after my ex-husband's deceit, the woman who had quietly structured my affairs, overseen my acquisitions, and guarded my secrets for decades. She was sharp, discreet, and utterly loyal. I called her office, and her assistant, Mrs. Gable, immediately put me through. Agnes's voice, when she answered, was crisp and professional, yet held a warmth reserved for those she trusted. "Eleanor," she said, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Agnes," I replied. "It's time." A brief pause on the other end. Agnes understood shorthand. "Time for what, my dear?" she asked, though I suspected she already knew. "Time to address the assumptions," I said, choosing my words carefully, specifically, those of my son-in-law, and by extension my daughter. I briefly recounted Thomas's latest maneuvering, his proposal for me to invest in his property venture, his continued disdain for my apartment and the building. I didn't need to go into great detail. Agnes knew the general dynamic. had seen the casual dismissiveness from Thomas during the few times their paths had crossed at family functions over the years, where Agnes was present merely as a family friend. He sees my apartment as my primary asset, I explained. He wants me to leverage it, to invest in his scheme. He believes this building is old and undervalued, that I am passive in its management. Agnes was silent for a moment, then a low chuckle came over the line. Undervalued, is it? Passive management. My dear Eleanor, if only he knew. What is it you wish to do? I want to set things straight, I said, not angrily, not vengefully, but clearly, unequivocally. I want them to understand the reality of my situation, the reality of what I have built, and the reality of their misjudgment. And how do you propose to do that? Agnes asked. Do you want me to send a formal letter, outline your holdings? No, I said immediately. That wasn't my style. Too distant, too cold. This needed to be personal. It needed to be a direct confrontation with their assumptions, delivered by me, in my space. I want to tell them myself. Here, in the apartment he finds so inadequate. A dramatic reveal, Agnes observed, a hint of amusement in her tone. Are you sure you're ready for the fallout, for their reaction? I've been ready for years, Agnes, I said. Their reaction is their own to manage. My concern is simply stating the truth, reclaiming my narrative, and making it clear that their attempts to manage me, to leverage my resources, are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am and what I possess. And the investment proposal, she asked, are you considering it? Considering using my money to fund a project proposed by a man who looks down on everything I am? I asked, a hint of ice in my voice. Absolutely not, but I will address it. I will use it as the point of departure for the conversation. Very well, Agnes said. What do you need from me? I need you to be available, I said. Not physically present, not yet, but I may need to reference legal documents, property deeds, perhaps have you confirm details if they doubt me. Doubt you? Agnes sounded indignant. Who would doubt you, Eleanor? They might, I said quietly. They see what they want to see. I can have copies of the relevant documents ready, Agnes offered. The deeds for the building, the accounts showing the rental income, the records of your other holdings. She trailed off, listing a portfolio that stretched far beyond this single property, properties she had helped me acquire and manage over the decades. Just the documents related to this building for now, I said, starting small. Let the initial shock sink in. We can address the rest later, if necessary. Consider it done, Agnes said. And Eleanor, be careful. Truth, delivered after long-held secrecy, can be a powerful and sometimes destructive force. I know, I said. I had lived with the destructive force of truth before. This time, however, I would be the one wielding it. Leaving Agnes's calm, capable hands, I felt a surge of resolve. The slow burn was reaching its peak. The pieces were in place. My small apartment, my quiet life, the facade of comfortable inadequacy. It had served its purpose. It had allowed them to reveal themselves fully, to show their true colors, their priorities, their lack of respect. And now it would serve as the stage for the unveiling. The symbolic object, the apartment itself, would be the backdrop for the inversion of the power dynamic they had so confidently established. They saw it as a symbol of my limitations. I would show them it was the key to my kingdom. I invited them over for a simple dinner, just the three of us. Sarah seemed surprised, as I usually met them at their place, or a neutral location. Here, Mom. It'll be a tight squeeze, she said, her attempt at humor falling flat. It's fine, I replied evenly. I thought it would be nice to have a quiet evening together. Thomas arrived, impeccably dressed as always, bringing a bottle of expensive wine he clearly expected me to be impressed by. He surveyed the living room with his usual air of constrained tolerance. Quaint, he murmured, setting the wine on my small dining table. Very compact. I ignored the barb. I had prepared a simple meal, roasted chicken, vegetables from the local market, a pie I'd baked myself, comfort food, food they probably hadn't eaten in years, accustomed as they were to catered meals and restaurant reservations. The conversation during dinner was stilted. Thomas talked about his day, his deals, the incompetence of his colleagues. Sarah offered supportive sounds, interjecting occasionally with anecdotes about their social life. I listened, ate, and observed. I saw the way Thomas subtly checked his watch, the way Sarah seemed slightly on edge, perhaps sensing a departure from our usual interactions, or perhaps just uncomfortable in the surroundings he so clearly disdained. After dinner, we moved back to the living room. Thomas settled onto the sofa, sighing softly, as if adjusting to a lesser degree of comfort than he was accustomed to. Sarah sat beside him, perched on the edge. The silence stretched for a moment, thick with unspoken things. This was it, the moment I had been building towards, consciously or unconsciously, for years. Thomas, I began, my voice calm, measured. You mentioned last week your property development opportunity, the one you needed investors for. He brightened slightly, clearly believing this was my lead-in to offering him money. Yes, Mother, he said, eager. It's a truly remarkable chance. As I explained, the potential returns are significant, and the location is prime. It's exactly the kind of project that elevates one's portfolio. You talked about acquiring land, I continued, and about the challenges, zoning, environmental reports, community issues. You seemed to think those were minor hurdles. He waved a hand dismissively. Standard procedure, Mother. Nothing we can't handle. And you mentioned that you thought buildings like this one. I gestured around the apartment, the gesture encompassing the building as a whole, were undervalued opportunities for someone with vision. He chuckled. Well, no offense, Mother, but yes, this building, bless its heart, isn't exactly cutting edge. Someone could really modernize it, maximize the space, perhaps convert it, get rid of the smaller, older units and build something truly profitable. It's valuable land, poorly utilized. He glanced around again, his expression one of a strategist analyzing a subpar asset. This apartment, for instance, he continued, emboldened. It's charming, yes, but inefficient, too small for modern living standards. You could get a decent price for it though, given the location. Put that money to work, maybe invest with me. Sarah gave me a hopeful look. This was their expectation. This was the path they envisioned for me. Sell the apartment, give Thomas the money, be a good, quiet, supportive mother. The irony of him sitting in my building, in my apartment, explaining how my property was poorly utilized, and how I should sell my home to invest in his scheme, was almost overwhelming. My heart, which had been beating a steady, controlled rhythm, began to pound a little harder, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment, the culmination of so many years of silent struggle, of being underestimated, of waiting. I met his gaze directly. His smile was confident, expectant. Sarah's was gentle, encouraging. They were completely unaware of the precipice they were standing on. I took a deep breath. The air in the room, which moments before had felt tight with their unspoken expectations, now felt charged, alive. The faint scent of lavender from the armchair, the ticking of the small clock, the quiet hum of the city outside, every detail seemed amplified, sharpened. This was it, the moment of truth. And it wasn't going to be a quiet, gentle unveiling. It was going to be a dismantling of everything they thought they knew. Thomas, I said again, my voice still calm, but with a new underlying strength, a steel I rarely allowed them to hear. You've made a number of assumptions about me, about my life, about this apartment, and about this building. He shifted slightly, perhaps sensing a change in my tone, but his confidence didn't waver. He probably thought I was about to express trepidation about investing, or perhaps negotiate terms. Mother, with all due respect, I'm simply trying to help you see the potential here, to make the most of your assets. My assets, I repeated, the phrase tasting different on my tongue now. Yes, let's talk about my assets. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze sweeping over both of them, holding their attention. You see this apartment, I said, gesturing around the small space. You see its size, its age, its simplicity, and you assume it represents the sum total of my worth, my capabilities, my financial standing. Thomas opened his mouth to interrupt, likely with a platitude about how money isn't everything, but I didn't let him. My voice remained steady, unwavering. You talk about this building, I continued, about its location, its potential, how it's undervalued, how someone with vision could transform it. His eyes flickered, a hint of unease beginning to register. Sarah looked from him to me, confused by the sudden shift in dynamic. What I think you don't understand, Thomas, I said, letting the full weight of my words sink in, is that the someone with vision you're referring to, that person already came along years ago. I paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Thomas frowned, trying to process my meaning. I don't follow, Mother, he said, his tone losing some of its earlier smoothness. What do you mean? I smiled then, a small tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. I mean, I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming intensely focused, that you're sitting in an apartment you consider inadequate, in a building you believe is undervalued and poorly utilized, talking to the woman who has owned it outright for the past 15 years. The words hung in the silence that followed, heavy and disruptive. Thomas's confident posture evaporated. His eyes widened, his jaw slackened slightly. He looked genuinely stunned, searching my face for any sign of a joke, a misunderstanding. Sarah gasped softly, her hand going to her mouth. Disbelief warred with confusion on her face. Owned the building. Thomas stammered, the color draining from his face. What are you talking about, Mother? You live here, in this apartment. This apartment is my home, I confirmed. But the building, 1428 Elm Street, I purchased it block by block, tenant by tenant, over many years. I renovated it, managed it, paid off the mortgages. It has been my primary focus, my primary investment, for decades. I saw the wheels turning in his head, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming mother-in-law, in her small apartment, with the reality of her being the owner of a substantial piece of city real estate. That's not possible, he whispered, shaking his head. You never said anything. You never asked the right questions, I responded calmly. You made assumptions based on what you saw, on what you expected to see. You saw a widow living simply, and concluded she had little. You saw an older building and concluded it was a neglected asset. I saw the dawning horror in his eyes, as he realized the full extent of his misjudgment, of his condescension, of the sheer cosmic irony of his position. He had mocked the size of my apartment, sitting in one of the smaller units of a building I owned, while asking me to invest in his property scheme, completely unaware that my property holdings likely dwarfed his entire portfolio. Sarah was silent, her eyes wide, looking between me and Thomas, struggling to comprehend this sudden seismic shift in her understanding of my life. The air was thick with the unspoken weight of years of assumptions, of polite fictions, of hidden realities. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted swiftly and decisively. He was no longer the confident, successful businessman advising the apparently less fortunate relative. He was a man whose carefully constructed perception of reality had just been shattered, sitting in judgment of the very source of wealth he had unknowingly sought to tap into. And this, I knew, was just the beginning. The revelation of my ownership was merely the key that unlocked the door to a much larger truth about my life, my struggles, and the quiet strength I had cultivated in the shadows. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Thomas looked utterly blindsided. His usual smooth composure had vanished, replaced by a stunned, almost panicked expression. Sarah was equally shocked, staring at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. The building, Thomas finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. You own this whole building. 1428 Elm Street. Yes, Thomas, I confirmed, my voice steady, free and clear. I watched him struggle to process this information, his mind, so quick to calculate profits and valuations when he was in control, seemed to seize up in the face of this unexpected reality. He had analyzed the location, the potential, but had completely missed the most crucial factor. The owner wasn't a tired, easily swayed individual with a modest holding. It was me, a woman he had systematically underestimated. But why? Sarah finally spoke, her voice small and trembling. Why didn't you ever tell us, Mom? Why live like this? She gestured around the apartment, the space suddenly seeming smaller, perhaps, or larger, depending on how she viewed it now. Live like this, I echoed softly. Sarah, this is my home. I chose it. It's comfortable, it's convenient, and it allowed me to be close to the business I was building. But the money, Thomas interjected, his mind snapping back to the financial implications. The value of this building, and the income it generates, that must be considerable. He wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was calculating what he had misjudged, what he had missed, what he might have leveraged. It's sufficient, I said, deliberately vague. Agnes had advised me to keep some things close to my chest, to reveal only what was necessary. The building ownership was necessary. The full extent of my portfolio was not, at least not yet, sufficient, he scoffed, regaining a fraction of his arrogance, quickly masked by a return of disbelief. Mother, buildings in this area, a property like this must be worth millions. It generates significant rental income. You've been sitting on a fortune while living like this. He couldn't reconcile the image, the quiet mother in her modest apartment, versus the wealthy property owner. It shattered his perception of me so completely that he couldn't seem to fit the pieces back together. Living like what, Thomas? I asked, my tone hardening slightly. Like someone who doesn't need fancy cars and sprawling houses to feel secure. Like someone who prefers privacy and simplicity to ostentation. Like someone who built her wealth through hard work and careful management, rather than inheriting it or seeking it through schemes. The word schemes hung in the air, a direct reference to his investment proposal. His face flushed. Sarah looked increasingly distressed, caught between her husband's obvious shock and my quiet dismantling truth. My choices about how I live are my own, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I didn't hide my wealth out of shame, but out of discretion, out of a desire for a quiet life, free from the kind of attention wealth often attracts. And frankly, I added, my gaze fixed on Thomas, to avoid attracting the kind of people who might be interested only in that wealth, rather than in me. This was the unspoken accusation, the core of the betrayal. They hadn't seen me, they had seen an opportunity, a potential resource to be exploited. Thomas visibly recoiled, the implication hitting its mark. Sarah looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. So I said, shifting the focus back to his proposal, when you came to me asking me to leverage my apartment, to invest in your property venture, you had no idea you were asking the owner of a multi-million-dollar building to contribute to your acquisition of a single piece of land. He was speechless. The irony was a physical presence in the room, suffocating him. He had presented himself as the expert, the visionary, offering me a chance to participate in his world of high finance, utterly unaware that I had been operating in that world, successfully, for far longer, and on a far greater scale than he could imagine. He had mocked my small apartment, his words echoing in the sudden vast space, created by the revelation of my ownership of everything around it. You see, Thomas, I said, leaning back in my chair, the earlier tension easing, replaced by a quiet sense of control. I wasn't just adequate, I was capable. I wasn't passive, I was strategic, and I wasn't sitting on a small undervalued asset. I was managing a significant portfolio, built from nothing. I saw the raw recalculation happening in his eyes, the rapid assessment of how badly he had misjudged, how much he had underestimated, how completely he had failed to see the reality of my power. Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe, confusion, and hurt. The hurt was for the years of perceived secrecy, the feeling that I hadn't trusted her with the truth of my life. And that, I knew, was the bittersweet part of this victory. The reclaiming of my power came at the cost of her naive perception, and perhaps a crack in our relationship. The immediate aftermath was a brittle silence, punctuated only by the still audible ticking of the mantelpiece clock, and the distant sounds of the city below. Thomas, stripped of his usual glibness, seemed to physically shrink on the sofa. His confidence had been shattered, his carefully constructed image of me as a resource to be managed completely demolished. Sarah, on the other hand, looked heartbroken. Not, I thought, necessarily by the revelation of my wealth, but by the realization that I had kept such a significant part of my life hidden from her. "Mom," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me? All those years," I thought. She trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of her misunderstanding. "You thought I was just getting by," I finished for her gently. "You thought I needed you and Thomas to look out for me, to help me manage my small affairs. That was easier, wasn't it? Easier than seeing the mother who had built everything from scratch, who didn't need rescuing. But why the secret?" she pressed. "Why live so humbly?" "It wasn't a secret, Sarah," I explained, choosing my words carefully. "It was privacy. After your father left, after the financial ruin, the public humiliation, I learned the value of keeping my own counsel, of building my life quietly, away from scrutiny. And frankly," I added, glancing at Thomas, who was still struggling to regain his composure, "it allowed me to see clearly who valued me for who I was, and who valued me for what they thought I had." This landed heavily. Sarah winced, understanding the implicit criticism of her husband, and perhaps of herself, for being influenced by him. Thomas finally found his voice, though it lacked its usual resonance. "Mother, I apologize. I had no idea. I feel like a complete fool." His apology felt less like genuine remorse, and more like damage control, an attempt to salvage the situation now that he understood the true landscape. "Your assumptions were based on what you chose to see, Thomas," I stated flatly. "You saw a small apartment and projected your ideas of limited means and capability onto the occupant. You saw an older building and assumed a passive, unsophisticated owner. But the investment," he ventured, ever the pragmatist, trying to pivot back to opportunity. "Perhaps we could still discuss collaboration, now that I understand your position." I looked at him, at the naked ambition and opportunism in his eyes, already recalculating how my wealth could benefit him. "Thomas," I said, my voice firm, "you came here asking me to fund your venture, based on the assumption that I had little to invest. You mocked the very space you hoped would provide the capital for your project. Do you really think I would entrust what I have built with someone who showed such a profound lack of judgment, such a complete disregard for understanding the person whose resources he sought?" He had no answer. The answer was obvious. The bridge between us, at least in a financial sense, was burned. Sarah was watching us, her face a mixture of sadness and dawning comprehension. She was beginning to see the man she had married through a different lens, a lens unclouded by the illusion of my perceived inadequacy. This was the bitter sweetness. The truth had set me free from their condescension, but it was causing pain to the daughter I had fought so hard to protect. "I built this," I said, my gaze sweeping around the apartment again, then indicating the building outside the window. "Every square foot, every lease, every repair. I did it for myself, yes, but I also did it to ensure that no matter what happened, I could always provide for myself, and for you, Sarah, if you ever needed it." The safety net I had built, the one she never knew she had, was finally visible. It wasn't a small hand-stitched thing. It was a vast, solid structure, built of brick and steel, and decades of unwavering determination. "All those years," Sarah murmured, tears welling in her eyes. "The hard work, you never complained." "There wasn't time for complaining," I said softly. "There was only time for building." The emotional weight of the moment settled over us. The air was thick with the unspoken history, the sacrifices, the misunderstandings. They had come expecting a simple dinner, perhaps to gently pressure me about their financial needs. They left with the undeniable truth of my quiet power, and the shattering realization of their own blindness. The power dynamic wasn't just inverted, it was utterly redefined. I was no longer the quiet, potentially dependent mother. I was the matriarch, the architect of my own fortune, standing firm on the ground I owned, looking out at a world I had shaped. While they stood, disoriented and exposed, on the periphery of a reality they had never imagined. The silence in the apartment after they left was different this time. Not heavy with their presence, but light with the absence of their assumptions. The air felt cleaner, clearer. The small space felt expansive, filled with the quiet hum of a life fully lived, fully realized, and now, finally, fully seen. The days that followed were tense. Sarah called, hesitant at first, her voice still laced with shock and confusion. She apologized for not seeing, for being so easily influenced by Thomas, for making assumptions. Her apology felt genuine, born from a place of regret, and a newfound understanding of the depth of my sacrifices. We talked for a long time, the conversation difficult but necessary. She asked questions she had never thought to ask before, about my life after her father, about how I managed, about the building. I answered honestly, sharing pieces of my past I had kept guarded for so long. The raw, difficult truth of those years, the poverty, the relentless work, the fear, the quiet determination. It wasn't a story of easy success, but one of grit and resilience. Hearing it, I think, helped her understand the why behind the secret, as she still saw it. It wasn't about keeping things from her. It was about protecting myself, and by extension, her, from the potential complexities and dangers that public wealth could bring, particularly after the betrayal of her father. It was also, I realized as I spoke, about not wanting to burden her with the weight of my struggles, or the knowledge of my significant assets, until I felt she was mature enough, settled enough, to handle it, and frankly, until I was sure her chosen partner wasn't solely motivated by it. That second part, the part about Thomas, remained largely unsaid between Sarah and me, a new fragile unspoken layer in our relationship. Thomas did not call, not directly. He sent a lengthy, carefully worded email. It was a masterpiece of attempting to salvage the situation, filled with more apologies, expressions of profound respect for my business acumen, and a renewed pitch for collaboration, now framed as a partnership between equals, a way for my wisdom and capital to combine with his drive and market insight. He even mentioned potential synergies between my existing portfolio and his proposed ventures. The audacity was almost admirable. He had been humbled certainly, but his core nature remained unchanged. He still saw me primarily as a source of potential financial gain, albeit one far larger and more formidable than he had previously imagined. I didn't respond to the email. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said, implicitly or explicitly, during that dinner. My silence was the answer, a firm, undeniable refusal. The power dynamic had been inverted, and I had no intention of allowing it to be subtly shifted back. I resumed my quiet routine. I met with Agnes, reviewed some potential new investment opportunities, checked in with the building manager, Mr. Henderson, a kind, elderly man who had worked for the building's previous owner, and stayed on, loyal and efficient. He knew, of course. He knew I was the owner, had known for years. He was one of the few people in my daily life who saw me fully, the quiet woman in apartment 7B, who also happened to be his boss, the woman who genuinely cared about the building and its tenants. His easy respect had always been a quiet comfort, a stark contrast to the condescension I received from others. I found myself walking around the building more, noticing the details Thomas had dismissed so readily. The intricate molding in the lobby I had restored, the sturdy brass railings on the stairwell I had replaced, the small, well-tended courtyard I had created in a previously neglected space. These weren't just features, they were tangible results of my vision, my investment, my care. They were proof of the active management he assumed was absent. The quiet strength I had cultivated over the years felt different now. It wasn't just a private reserve. It was something that had been tested, revealed, and had held firm. I hadn't exploded in anger, hadn't gloated, hadn't sought vengeance. I had simply stated the truth, and that truth, in its quiet power, had been enough to dismantle their illusions. The bittersweet element remained. Sarah was still married to Thomas. While our relationship had taken a significant step towards honesty and understanding, the presence of her husband, whose fundamental character had been so clearly revealed, cast a shadow. Could she truly reconcile the man she loved with the man who had shown such shallow opportunism and condescending disregard? Only time would tell. For now our calls were warmer, more open. The years of unspoken history were slowly being unpacked. My small apartment remained my home. It didn't feel inadequate. It felt like the control center of my world, a world far larger and more complex than anyone outside its walls had ever known. Thomas and Sarah still came to visit occasionally, but the dynamic was irrevocably changed. His arrogance was replaced by a forced politeness, a wary respect he couldn't quite conceal. Sarah was quieter, more observant. The mockery was gone, replaced by a palpable awareness of the true scale of my reality. The small apartment, once a symbol of perceived limitation, had become a symbol of my quiet strength, my strategic independence, and the profound irony of their misjudgment. The shift in their behavior wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable, a gradual recalibration of their approach to me. Thomas, in particular, was cautious, almost deferential. The easy confidence he'd exuded in my presence was gone, replaced by an uncertain politeness. He no longer offered unsolicited advice about my finances or my living situation. The topic of his property ventures, which had once dominated conversation, was now conspicuously absent. When it did come up, usually through Sarah mentioning it, Thomas would offer a brief, factual update, carefully avoiding any hint of seeking my input or investment. He seemed to be trying to demonstrate competence and success on his own terms, perhaps hoping to regain some standing in my eyes, or perhaps simply trying to prove to himself that he didn't need my wealth. Sarah was trying harder, too. She was more attentive, more curious about my life, beyond the superficial pleasantries. She asked about the building, about the tenants, about my day-to-day activities. It felt like she was genuinely trying to bridge the gap created by years of misunderstanding and my deliberate concealment. We talked about my past, about the struggles I faced after her father left, the sheer grinding effort it took to rebuild. I shared stories I had never told her, not wanting to burden her with the harsh realities of my early years alone. I told her about working 3 jobs, about the fear of not being able to pay the rent, about teaching myself bookkeeping and contract law, late at night, after she was asleep. I told her about the first small office space I bought, the leaky roof, the difficult tenants, the moments of despair when I thought I couldn't continue. Sharing these stories wasn't easy. It meant revisiting painful memories, but it was necessary. It allowed her to see the foundation of my wealth, not as some mysterious inherited fortune, but as something forged in fire, piece by painstaking piece. It allowed her to understand that the woman who lived simply wasn't doing so out of necessity, but out of choice, a choice rooted in the hard-won wisdom of experience. The bittersweetness lingered. While our relationship was becoming more honest, the knowledge of her husband's initial motives, his blatant opportunism, hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm between his world and mine. I could see that Sarah was grappling with this too. She loved him, I knew she did, but she couldn't unsee his reaction to my revelation. The way his eyes had lit up at the mention of millions, the swift pivot from condescension to calculated interest. It had revealed a part of him she perhaps hadn't fully confronted before. The apartment itself seemed to breathe differently. It was no longer just my home. It was the quiet witness to a profound shift. The familiar objects, the old armchair, the ticking clock, the view from the window, they held the memory of that evening. The moment the facade dropped and the truth emerged, they were no longer symbols of perceived inadequacy, but markers of resilience, strategy, and an undeniable power. I still lived simply. My clothes were plain. My meals were modest. I didn't own a car, preferring to walk or take public transport. These choices were deliberate. They were part of the life I had built, a life grounded in practicality and freedom from the endless pursuit of more. Thomas still lived in his world of conspicuous consumption and ambitious deals. Sarah navigated between our two realities, a bridge between the mother who built an empire quietly and the husband who chased success loudly. The tension hadn't vanished entirely. It had simply changed form. It was no longer the tension of anticipation, waiting for the moment of revelation. It was the tension of living with the aftermath, the quiet ripple effects of a truth long hidden, now laid bare. I found a quiet satisfaction in the new dynamic. I was no longer undervalued, no longer underestimated. I was seen finally, for the quietly strong woman I was, the woman who had taken betrayal and hardship and turned them into a foundation of unshakable security, not just for myself, but potentially for my daughter's future, in ways she still didn't fully grasp. The small apartment was no longer a symbol of my limitations in their eyes. It was a symbol of my strategic brilliance,
my unwavering resolve, and the profound depth of their misjudgment. And that, in its own way, was a quiet, powerful triumph. The years following the revelation brought a different kind of relationship with Sarah. Thomas remained politely distant, his interactions with me careful and measured. The casual mockery was gone, replaced by a wary respect that felt earned, not freely given. His business ventures seemed to have mixed success, but he no longer spoke of them to me in any detail, and certainly never hinted at any need for my assistance. He had learned, the hard way, that I was not a resource to be easily tapped or manipulated. Sarah and I grew closer. The initial shock and hurt she felt about my secrecy gradually softened into understanding and a deeper appreciation for the mother I was and the struggles I had overcome. She came to visit me more often, sometimes alone, and we would talk for hours. We'd sit in the small living room, the setting of that pivotal dinner, and she would ask about my life, my work, my thoughts on the world. She started to see the building itself through different eyes, not as an old, slightly dated structure, but as a testament to my resilience and vision. She learned about the tenants, heard stories about the community I had fostered here, understood the intricate dance of managing a property and the lives within it. It was a different kind of education than she had received in her privileged life. She saw the quiet power in fostering relationships, in consistent, reliable management, in building something tangible and lasting. She began to express doubts about her own path, about the relentless pursuit of external markers of success that characterized her husband's world. She saw the quiet contentment in my life, the freedom from the constant pressure to acquire more, and she started to question her own values. This was a painful process for her, leading to tension in her marriage. I didn't interfere, didn't offer advice, unless explicitly asked. It was her life, her choices to make, but I was there, a quiet presence, a stable point of reference. The apartment remained my anchor. Its familiarity, its simplicity, felt more comforting than ever. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a space imbued with history, with struggle, with triumph. It was a reminder of how far I had come, from the young woman weeping in the old armchair after her world collapsed, to the woman who now owned the very ground that armchair sat on, and so much more. The initial bitterness towards Thomas had faded, replaced by a sense of detachment, and perhaps a touch of pity. He was still trapped in a world where value was measured by external validation, by the opinions of others, by the endless accumulation of possessions. He had missed the greatest opportunity of all, the opportunity to see the true worth in a person, regardless of their outward circumstances. The irony of the situation never completely disappeared. Every time they visited, every time Thomas sat stiffly on my sofa, surrounded by the evidence of the life he had mocked, there was a silent acknowledgement of the reversed roles. He was a guest in my kingdom, no longer a judge of my perceived limitations. My quiet strength was no longer hidden. It was the foundation upon which our interactions were built. It wasn't an aggressive display of power, but a calm, undeniable presence. I had been undervalued, betrayed, and dismissed, but I had not been broken. I had taken the fragments of a shattered life and meticulously, patiently, built something new, something solid, something that could not be taken away by lies or condescension. The small apartment, the subject of his scorn, was not a symbol of my defeat, but a testament to my victory. A quiet, bittersweet, profoundly empowering victory.
The redemptive aspect wasn't in transforming Thomas, who remained largely unchanged, but in deepening my relationship with Sarah, in finally allowing her to see the true depth of my resilience and capability, and in reclaiming my own narrative, my own worth, in the face of years of being overlooked. I was an older woman in a small apartment, yes, but I was also the owner of the building, the architect of my own fortune, the quiet force they had never seen coming. And in that reality, there was a profound, lasting peace. The lavender scent from the armchair still lingered. It no longer smelled of past tears, but of quiet strength, of resilience, of a life fully claimed and finally undeniably seen.